Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am the Omni viewer, and welcome to Omni at the Movies. Today, I'll be sharing my thoughts on Thor Ragnarok. I think it's safe to say that Thor is, rather oddly, one of the more divisive entries in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. While it seems everybody loves the characters, and especially likes how they're incorporated into the Avengers movies, the solo Thor movies tend to have opinions vary wildly depending on who you ask. One common thing I've seen a lot of people saying recently is that the Thor movies don't seem to do much to upset the status quo in the MCU, certainly not in the same way the Captain America movies have done as of late. Why only the Thor movies have been singled out for this and not movies like Iron Man 2 or Ant-Man, I don't know. But that seems to be the prevailing opinion. For my own part, I've always felt the Thor movies are good, and that each time they've gotten progressively better. The first Thor movie was a good introduction, and gave us some great characterization, but I feel that of all the Phase 1 movies, it suffered the worst from having Avengers build-up forced into it. By which I mean, Black Widow played an active role in Iron Man 2, which justified her presence there. Meanwhile, Hawkeye plays an entirely passive role in Thor. He doesn't even fire his arrow, he's basically just there to provide running commentary with Agent Coulson a la MST3K. There was no reason for him to be there at all. You know, aside from the fact that this was the only place for them to set him up for the Avengers. Cramming in all of this build-up wound up detracting from the stuff on Asgard, which meant we didn't have as much time to fully understand the interaction between the Asgardians, particularly why Sif and the Warriors 3 are so put off by Loki taking the throne. However, the dynamic between Thor and Loki was great, and it was even better in Thor the Dark World. In fact, I feel Thor the Dark World was a big improvement in terms of scope and storytelling. There was no longer a need to force in the connectivity because that had already been taken care of. And the story just felt bigger. We weren't limited to just the castle of Asgard or an unnamed town in New Mexico. We got to see other worlds, we got to see giant spaceships and armies of dark elves. I honestly don't understand where all of the recent hatred for it is stemming from. Although I have noticed most of that hatred has only popped up after Doug Walker did his negative review for Disneycember. Just throwing that out there as an observation. So getting to Thor Ragnarok, I'm happy to say that it upholds the pattern. It is the best Thor movie we have to date. It is uniquely its own thing. In fact, this is so very clearly the director's own take on things that I'm kind of glad it took us this long to get a Thor movie of this type, because it never would have flown in Phase 1 or 2. You may recall the falling out between Marvel and Edgar Wright over Ant-Man, but let's not dwell on that. From start to finish, Thor Ragnarok is just plain fun, and there is so much going on in it, stuff that the trailers haven't even remotely hinted at. I won't spoil anything here, but trust me, there are some very interesting developments. Interestingly, the writing is vastly different from how the previous Thor movies have gone, to the point where, at first, I admit I was a bit jarred by it. That mostly stems from how the dialogue was written. The Asgardians of the MCU don't speak in that faux Elizabethan style they do in the comics, but they've always spoken in a far more proper way than all the characters around them. That's gone in Ragnarok. The dialogue is far more reminiscent of the Guardians of the Galaxy if I had to compare it to anything else in the MCU. Less refined, less proper, heavier on the snark, if you will. I got used to it very quickly, but it was unexpected to hear Thor talking more like Star-Lord than he ever has before. Speaking of Thor, the characters continue to be great. As you might expect, the dynamic between Thor and Loki remains amazing. That's always been the highlight every time those two have appeared together. Anthony Hopkins finally feels like he's actually invested in playing Odin. I mean, not that he's ever been bad in the role, but I always got the impression he wasn't exactly thrilled to be in these movies. And of course, there is the Hulk. Hulk finally gets to be more than just a roaring, mindless beast in this movie. And he finally gets to speak more dialogue than one 2-line sentence a movie. The result is incredibly amusing. I would say that in this movie, Hulk is basically like a giant kid. There are indeed many scenes throughout where he acts very childish. This may be a little jarring to some, though it wasn't as jarring for me as the dialogue change was, but I also think it's perfectly fitting for the character. Jeff Goldblum's take on the Grandmaster is one of the most hilarious things you're going to see in the MCU. And in fact, I really don't want to say anything more than that. I just want his performance to speak for itself, and for you to just go in and not know what to expect. The music is unusual, but I mean that in a good way. There's a serious 1980s science fiction vibe to the soundtrack. There's a heavy use of synthesizers in amongst all the symphonic elements. You've heard bits and pieces of it in the trailers up to this point, and oddly enough, it's kinda fitting. Especially since this movie even kind of looks like a 1980s sci-fi film, especially when we're on planet Sakaar. But I honestly think what appeals to me the most about Thor Ragnarok is the fact that it finally seems to have embraced the fact that these movies should have been fantasy from the beginning. Of all the Thor films, it really does feel the most like fantasy. And even I think that's weird of me to say considering how many sci-fi elements are in this thing, but it's true, it feels like fantasy. The past 2 Thor movies have been trying too hard to keep things grounded, when they really shouldn't have been. The attitude has always been, no, they're not gods, they're aliens. Immortal aliens who live in mythical realms and have devices that operate like magic, but we swear it's just technology. Really advanced technology that looks like magic, even though it isn't. Seriously, this is grounded stuff here. So an attempt to be grounded instead became outright restraint. But of course, now that we have Doctor Strange in the mix... Side note, Doctor Strange's cameo is also a great moment. It seems as if Thor Ragnarok has finally allowed the series to cut loose. Heck, this is the first time the characters have actually referred to themselves as proper gods. Remember how at the beginning of Thor the Dark World there was an entire exchange devoted to saying the Asgardians weren't gods? Well, now they're calling themselves gods left and right. Everything is big and strange and doesn't necessarily make sense. At least not in a scientific way it doesn't. But for fantasy, it makes perfect sense. Perhaps this appeals to me because I've always preferred comic book movies that embrace the strangeness of the source material rather than reject it. But I think most people will agree that regardless of how you feel about the previous 2 Thor movies, Thor Ragnarok really is the best of the bunch. And even though it does a little bit of setup for future films and does have certain plot points that require you to have seen previous films, it nonetheless manages to stand on its own. What more can I say? If you haven't seen it already, go and see it. Then again, at this point, I don't think I have to tell you to go see Marvel movies, do I? So, what did you guys think? Did you like Thor Ragnarok? Do you think it's the best, the worst, or somewhere in the middle when it comes to Thor movies, or the MCU in general? Any particular favorite moments that stand out? As always, feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments section below. Until such time as we meet again, this is the Omni Viewer signing off.